week, of course, I'll be moving on to a new historical topic, of course, which is the British Empire. We'll get into the rise of the British, which British Empire, is often people hate it, that kind of thing. People talk a lot of bad things. I know when Queen Elizabeth II died, they were like, "Oh, she died, had a horrible death," and things like that. Some people said, which was terrible, that kind of thing. But yeah, the British, they are known for colonialism and their vast empire, which was a large-sized empire, but they did advance a lot of things in the world. They spread democracy throughout the world. Like without, I guess, the British, we wouldn't have the United States and all of that. So there's some positive things that the British did that totally changed the world as it is today. Of course, later, if you have any comments, questions about this live stream, about this lecture, let me know, of course, later. You can also subscribe to my channel also as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the background, of course, of the rise of the British Empire, which, the British Empire, rose to power because of these different dynasties. We'll talk about, I'll mostly talk about the Tudor Dynasty, which of course, I'll get into and discuss how, the Tudors, really the ones that kind of started overall. But it's not just that, the Stewart Dynasty, House of Hanover, I think those also were kind of major players in why they became, a great empire overall. And it's amazing. One of the amazing things, about the British Empire is the fact that it, rose out of a small state. If you really study about the United Kingdom itself, it's only like 90-something thousand square miles. England, Scotland, Wales, and pretty much Northern Ireland are the main areas that make up the UK, or Great Britain, Britain as they call it as well. And so that's one of the amazing things about, the empire, that it was able to actually do all that. Let me show you, of course, some images of the British. Of course, a lot of flags, represent, the British, and, they create all these different states, throughout the world. There's so many different countries that were, created because of the British Empire. You can see some of the famous flags like, Australia, New Zealand, Canada kind of sometimes still use some of these British, flags. The Union Jack, of course, used in a lot of images. And you can see here all the vast dominions of the British Empire, which you can see, I think they say under King George V, that was the peak of the British Empire, which kind of peaked around World War I or right after World War I overall. But you can see they were in pretty much the Americas, not as much compared to, say, Africa, parts of Asia, Australia, in the Pacific. So their vast empire was huge. You can see all the different, another map showing the British Commonwealth later and all that. But those are all the different flags of the British, or what was the British Empire, I guess, at one point. And they say like 1922, that was the actual peak year of when the British Empire peaked. 458 million people, it says, had lived under the British Empire at one point, which was actually like almost like 1/4 of the world's population. That's kind of give you an idea of how large it was. And, it was the largest empire in the world. British Empire, 33,000 something million, 33 million something kilometers. You can see square kilometers you're looking at. Or if you want the miles, I think it's 13.7 million square miles was how big it was. And then the Mongol Empire, Russian Empire, of course, were second and third in comparison of how big they were. Now, I'm going to first talk about the Tudor Dynasty today, get into them. We'll start on the Stuart one as well. I should have time to do that also as well. But yeah, a lot of the early empire really starts with the Tudors, who reigned over England between 1485 to 1603. They did for a while also, they were kings of Ireland as well, Queen of Ireland also as well, which I think Henry VIII was the first king of Ireland they had. And the Tudors, you look at here, I think I've got an image showing you the different monarchs that were part of it. But here's we'll get to Henry VIII a little later. He starts the English Reformation and all that. But I think I've got a kind of a family tree, if I can share it with you, which is right here of the Tudors. But the Tudors start with a man named Henry Tudor, who you see at the top left of the Tudor family tree. He was married to Elizabeth of York, and he founded, they believe, after the end of the War of the Roses, which was a civil war that broke out in England that occurred in the mid to late 15th century, 1455 to 1485. It was called the War of the Roses because supposedly in the two royal families that fought each other, the Lancasters and the Yorks, they had like a different colored rose in their coat of arms, which I think the Lancaster was a red rose and the Yorks was a white rose, and so hence the name was used. And the Lancasters and Yorks were part of the so-called Plantagenet dynasty, which was a medieval dynasty of England that went back a bunch of centuries. And anyway, after the war ended, he seized power, Henry Tudor, and he became Henry VII. And I guess the smooth differences over, he married Elizabeth of York, who was from the York family, and Henry was from the Lancaster family. So the two kind of merged together, the two families. You can see all the relatives that he had. Of course, the most famous, is Henry VIII. That's the main son, of course, of Henry Tudor. He also had another son named Arthur, who was supposed to reign, but he died young, and then Henry took over as the actual king. And then you see on the bottom left there, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Those are all the daughters of Henry VIII. He had, through, of course, 3 different wives. We'll get to that later about Henry's, 6 wives and all that. But yeah, these are all the different Tudor monarchs. So after Henry VII, Henry VIII, he had Edward VI, Mary I, and then Queen Elizabeth I also as well. So there are basically 5 main Tudor monarchs that they actually had. Now, of course, the main thing we'll get to today and talk about is the fact that, Henry VIII was very famous for the English Reformation. That's the thing that he really started that really changed England or Britain forever. And if you know about the English Reformation, it was something that he did through Parliament. Parliament passed a bunch of acts that created the Church of England or Anglican Church. And I think I talked about this before when I talked about the Reformation, but part of why Henry, created this new church was because of the fact that he needed a male heir to the throne. And Henry VIII is very famous for his, 6 wives of Henry VIII. I'll kind of go into that and talk about that. There's the family tree, of course, of Henry VIII, but Henry VIII had all these different wives he had. Of course, they had a lot of songs about Henry VIII that's very famous, which I think the one that you may have heard of is the one by the Hermans Hermits that was made in the 1960s called Henry VIII. That's called, which actually the song is not about Henry VIII. It's about this man that this woman wants to marry, and he only wants to marry a man named Henry. So he's the 8th Henry to get that. But anyway, they kind of, I guess, use that off of his name and all that and who he is. But Henry had all these wives, that he had, the so-called 6 wives of Henry VIII. And apparently it was his first wife we talked about before, which was Catherine of Aragon. Usually spelled the K. And she was a Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And she only had like one child that survived, which was Queen Mary I, or Bloody Mary, as they called her later. Yeah, that was the only one she had really that survived. And so Henry had a bunch of illegitimate children. He had this one illegitimate son named Henry Fitzroy, I guess, who could have got the throne, but he wasn't, of course, born from her. And so that's basically the reason why he would form this church to basically get a new wife and obviously maybe get a new son, like an heir to the throne and all that. If you know about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, they often like joke about it. There's they use kind of a rhyme to kind of, study the names. And remember all the different wives of Henry VIII, and it kind of goes like this: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And so each one had something happen to her. Anne Boleyn was beheaded later after Catherine of Aragon was divorced, of course. Then, of course, Jane Seymour died. We'll get to that later. Catherine Howard was later also executed as well, beheaded. Anne of Cleves was also divorced. And then Catherine Parr actually survived. She actually outlived Henry VIII and all that. Also, another thing about, I'll come back to the wives of Henry VIII also as well. But part of what happened with Parliament created this act that was called the Act of Supremacy. And what it basically did was it made the British monarch the head of not just the state, but the church. So that's why that was a big deal. When Queen Elizabeth II died, she was the head of the church. Originally was supreme head, now it's supreme governor. And so after that, Henry then controlled all the church lands. He even made all the clergy take an oath to the new Church of England. And anybody that refused, to not do that were either, sacked from power, or in the case of, about what happened to Sir Thomas More, who refused to take an oath, he was executed by Henry VIII. And Henry VIII, he was a vicious man. He had thousands of people killed in England that wouldn't support his church or support his policies. He was kind of like Darth Vader, really, the way, Darth Vader would kill somebody off if he wasn't doing their job right. He was kind of like that, Henry VIII, for sure. So, yeah, definitely, for sure. And if you know about it too, about this church he created, it was really a Catholic church. That's the weird thing about it. He was actually excommunicated by the Pope at one point, but basically it became this quasi-Catholic church with him the head of it and all that. And so from a while they called it after that Henrician Catholicism, but later when his son would come in, who was King Edward VI, it would become more like a Protestant church, but it would kind of evolve over time throughout the English Reformation, up all the way down to, of course, Queen Elizabeth I's reign as well. So we'll talk about that later, how it kind of evolves over time. One thing about this church, it's kind of like a mix between a Catholic and a Protestant church. So they kind of use Catholic ideas in it and things like that. They did keep a lot of the main bishops. Like, if you know about the Anglican Church, there's two main bishops they have: the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the more important one, and the Archbishop of York also. So those are the main religious leaders. And then, of course, the current monarch now, which is King Charles III, who is the son of Elizabeth II. He reigns over the church now as supreme governor today. Let me go back and talk about the wives of Henry VIII. I didn't really go into them and all that right here, but kind of talk about the other ones he had as well. There was also Anne Boleyn. She was, of course, one of the daughters of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth would be one of her daughters that's famous later as a queen and all that. But she's one that's, of course, the one that he ends up marrying after he really annulled the first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And the marriage would last 3 years. And he was highly disappointed that Anne Boleyn only gave him, a daughter, Elizabeth, of course, later, Queen Elizabeth I and all that. And so he had her put on trial for different treason and things like that, and executed in 1536. And so she was beheaded. So that's what happened to the second wife. Only lasted about 3 years of that marriage. Then the third wife, which is top right there, Jane Seymour. It was, I think both of Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour were ladies in waitings at one point. And Jane Seymour was his favorite. That's when he started kind of courting as he was trying to get rid of Anne Boleyn. And she would have one son with him, of course, later, which is Edward VI. We'll talk about later as well. But she died in childbirth complications. Right after he was born, she died in 1537. And so that's how she of course, is gone. So after that, that's how pretty much those three are dead. The other ones on the bottom, they're not as famous, but he didn't have any children with him either. But you had bottom left, you had Anne of Cleves, who was actually German, known as Anne von Cleve, who came over from Germany, from the Holy Roman Empire. It was kind of a political marriage because England was trying to, create some kind of close alliance with Germany. And apparently he didn't like her. And so he decided not to, I guess, consummate the marriage. I don't think they ever consummated it. And so he divorced her in 1540. Then the one on the bottom in the middle was Catherine Howard, who he married, they think, close to 1540 after he divorced Anne von Cleves. And she was a teenager. They're not sure how old she was. I think I get different dates on that, 15 to 19 years old, they think. But apparently after he married her, he found out that she was having an affair with one of her cousins, a man named Thomas Culpeper, who, by the way, happened to be a friend of Henry VIII too, as well. And so she was eventually arrested, thrown in the Tower of London, and executed in 1542. So was he also as well. Then his final wife, the sixth wife on the bottom right, is Catherine Parr, divorcee who had been married 2 times before. He had been married 5 times before, and it was like, I guess, a love match, that kind of deal. But she outlived him. That's one thing that she is kind of famous for, by the way. So those are all the famous wives of Henry VIII. It's kind of a soap opera, if you know about that with him. But the death of Henry VIII, that would occur in January of 1547. He would eventually leave the throne to his son. His son would take over, of course, Edward VI, of course, through, told you, Jane Seymour. And he's important. I'll kind of talk about him a little bit. He, of course, is very important at the top right there. He's going to be the first Protestant ruler they have of England, who will reign for about 6 years. Anyway, it was him, or either, I guess the other option was to put Mary on the throne, which Mary, you see there on the left, Queen Mary the First later, was the half sister Edward VI. A lot of people didn't want her because she was, actually raised Catholic, because her mother was Catherine of Aragon. And so he came in, and one of the first things that they start to happen under his reign is the church starts going more from being Catholic to being Protestant. And under Edward, they had the Archbishop of Canterbury, you see there, named Thomas Cranmer. He officially adopted what became the Book of Common Prayer, which they were kind of working on at the time. I think under Henry VIII's reign, they were kind of starting to work on it, I think. And then they finalized it, the additions of it under him. And so from there, if you know about the Church of England, it became more of a Protestant church that was heavily influenced by Calvinism, which is true about that. And so it starts to go from being Catholic to being Protestant. Now, the only problem was that Henry was ill. I don't know if you know the story about Henry's son, Edward VI. He had tuberculosis. And so he decided that the throne could not go to Mary the First, later Bloody Mary, as they call her later also as well, who was Catholic. And so he wrote up the succession idea to give the throne to this woman named Lady Jane Grey, who was his first cousin. And so basically, with Edward's death in 1553, it sparked a lot of controversy with her coming in. And she would try to seize power in July of that year. And so she didn't last long. If you know about Lady Jane Grey, she has a nickname later that they call her. She's called the 9 Days Queen. So she reigned from July 10th to July 19th, 1553. And it's because of the fact that Mary Tudor, who was, the half sister of Edward, said, "Hey, you're not going to do that because I should be the rightful heir at this point." So she comes in, has the backing of the military, and overthrows her and puts her in the Tower of London where she's later executed in 1554. And so she comes in and takes over at that point ruling. So that's Mary, of course, on the left, with, of course, like I said, the half brother Edward VI. She would reign for about around 5 years. She was not popular and is still not popular today. I think in English, they still don't like her today. Of course, she had the sobriquet or nickname, which is Bloody Mary. I guess that's kind of where the nickname of the drink came. The alcoholic drink you may have heard of called the Bloody Mary. And anyway, Mary's reign was famous for a lot of things. The most famous thing that she really did was she started this counter-reformation in the country, where as soon as she got in, she started to try and reconvert the country back to being Catholic. So she closed down the Anglican Church. She started what they call the so-called Marian persecutions, where she put a lot of Protestants either in prison or she had them executed. And I think they say almost 280 something Protestants were actually executed during her reign, including being burned at the stake, which the most famous was Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was actually burned at the stake in 1556 under her reign. And so that's part of why she was, unpopular with that. There was something else too, if you know about it. The thing that really set off a lot of the British, the English at the time, that didn't like her, was she decided to marry a Spanish prince, Prince Philip, who was the son of Emperor Charles V, who we talked about before. And so he came over from Spain, a Catholic, marrying a Catholic, and a lot of the English didn't like that. They wanted her to marry an Englishman, maybe someone who was Protestant, possibly even as well. And so it sparked a huge rebellion in the country, which was called Wyatt's Rebellion, which broke out in the winter of January, February 1554, which started all over England, although they say that the area that it really broke out was Kent, which is kind of in the southeastern part of England today, where close to where Dover in Kent is. But you can see it was all over southern England, Leicester, Devon, and also Hereford and other areas of the country. And they had this man you see on the right that kind of led it. His name was, it was named after Sir Thomas Wyatt. He was actually the main leader of it, who lived in the area of Kent, the southeastern part of England. And I think he had actually been friends with Elizabeth, Lady Elizabeth I, And I think there was a theory he was either going to try to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, who was in the Tower of London, or also Elizabeth, who had also been in prison also as well. But the thing failed. And Mary was able to basically arrest him and have him executed. And so the whole thing was, of course, put down. But there was a scare, I know, right before her death, right after the rebellion. There was talk of Mary's impending pregnancy, that she was going to give birth and all that. But it turns out she had cancer in her uterus, and she died from cancer in 1558. So a lot of the English people were kind of like, oh, we got spared, of having another Catholic ruler after that. And so that would lead into, of course, Queen Elizabeth, of course, coming in next. And that's what we're going to talk about last with the Tudors, of course, is the Elizabethan era with Queen Elizabeth. She'll reign during a very important period in British history. It's often referred to as the Elizabethan era, but quite commonly also called the Golden Age of England. This occurred pretty much between the late 16th and early 17th century. The Virgin Queen, is considered really one of the most famous monarchs in British history. A lot of people think she's the one that kind of starts the early British Empire. She's definitely a lot better monarch than Henry VIII was. I think those two are definitely the two most famous monarchs Probably, I think those two are the most famous in probably British history total overall. And why was she called the Virgin Queen? If you know much about Elizabeth, she never married. So she never took like a consort husband. And then they think that she was a virgin. Pretty much, I know they've had stories about she may have had, all these different affairs with, I think there was Sir Robert Dudley, I think was her court favorite, you may have heard of, and all that. But they do think that she remained a virgin, throughout her life, and she never took a husband and all that. Besides being called the Virgin Queen, she was called other names like Good Queen Bess, which that's kind of a misnomer. They think she could be bad too, because she also put people to death. Also, throughout anybody against her reign, she had put to death, including her cousin. I'll get to later, Mary, Queen of Scots. She had her executed as well. And then she was also called Gloriana, also as well. So yeah, she's the greatest, one of the last of the Tudor monarchs because she had no children. She's the fourth longest reigning. She reigned like 44 to 45 years, with the longest reigning, being the ruler that died last month. Queen Elizabeth II had reigned a little over 70 years, to kind of give you a comparison of the two, how long they've been. I think the 3 of the 4 longest have been female rulers, including Queen Victoria. Now I'll kind of get into Queen Elizabeth's reign and discuss her. The big thing that Elizabeth did during her reign was reforms with the church. You have to understand that the English Reformation was still going on. In fact, it kind of continued up under her reign. And so she went through this period where the Parliament passed a bunch of acts that kind of continued the so-called English Reformation. And they often call it the so-called Elizabethan religious settlement. I think it's kind of a nickname they dub it. And what happened with the church was that it was reopened under Elizabeth because, Mary had closed it down when she was the ruler for around 5 years. And so these are some of the things that she did. Besides making it more Protestant and all that, she also made other things that reforms the church as well. Like she kept the clergy, which Mary tried to get rid of. So she kept all the bishops and the priests that are part of the Anglican Church. Pretty much they brought back the English sermons because Mary tried to, have everything Latin again. Book of Common Prayer was brought back as well. That became the permanent prayer book that the church still uses today. Of course, the church is famous for allowing clergy to marry, which usually you have to marry before you get ordained and all that. And under this church, it was not basically, they did not have religious freedom. It was like a state church. That was kind of a mix between a Catholic and a Protestant church, but attendance was mandatory. You had to tithe the church and things like that. And if you didn't, you might be fined, or even I think there was cases where people were in prison, believe it or not. And this was all done because of the Act of Uniformity passed in 1559, which required people to go to church and things like that. It also reestablished the Book of Common Prayer, etc. But that's part of why later people left England. If you know about that, came to America and other countries because of the fact that there was no religious freedom in pretty much in England at the time. Now I'm going to talk about also there, of course, is the Canterbury Cathedral. By the way, that is the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that's kind of considered one of several cathedrals that are famous in England today. The other one you may have seen, by the way, when they had the state funeral, of course, Queen Elizabeth II, is Westminster Abbey, where a lot of kings and queens, etc., have been either coronated there or married there. I think going all the way back to, I want to say, the time of William the Conqueror, they've had monarchs that have been crowned there. And of course, you saw the state funeral of Elizabeth II also took place there as well. Now, Elizabeth had this cousin that she had that was in Scotland. If you know about her, she was the closest heir to the throne, the one that would really get it if she died, because Elizabeth did not have any children. She was the Queen of Scotland for about 20 years, from 1547 to 1567. She ruled over Scotland, which was ruled, by the way, by the Stewart Dynasty, which went back to the 14th century in the late Middle Ages. And she was kind of controversial because of the fact that she had a lot of men that she kind of went through. I've kind of got an image here. I've got this, but she at one point had 3 husbands that she married, which you see here in that image. She had also a bunch of lovers, apparently, too, also. But the one on the far left is Francis II. When she was very young, she went to France and she married the King of France, who was Francis II there, but he died young at 16. And so she came back to Scotland and then married this cousin in the middle named Lord Darnley. He was known as Henry Stewart. He was also a Stewart like her. And the only thing about Lord Darnley was that he was a drunk. She didn't really like him. And she had this lover on the side named David Rizzio. He was like Italian and I think an advisor to her. And Lord Darnley was kind of suspect about it and had him killed, David Rizzio. And so later she had this other man named the Earl of Bothwell, named James Hepburn. I think later they were lovers. And there's a theory that the two conspired to have Lord Darnley killed. And so he was actually murdered later. And then he then married Earl of Bothwell. So the whole thing was kind of like a soap opera, with her reign also as well. And so because of her being implicated with the death of Lord Darnley, it became a big scandal in the country. She was eventually imprisoned in Scotland at one point, but she escaped to England, is what happened. She got driven out the country. Part of why she got driven out, if you know about it, was due to John Knox. Knox, if you remember correctly, had started the Scottish Reformation in the 16th century, founding the Church of Scotland, which the Scots call it the Kirk, if you know about that. And so they didn't want a Catholic, person on the throne and all that. And so she basically was run out the country. And Mary had a son who was just like an infant, which was James, King James, of course, later, who becomes the King of Scotland, later King of England. He'll take over and he becomes a Protestant ruler and all that. Now, Mary thought that she could just flee to England. And what would happen was Elizabeth would help her get her throne back. But that's not what happened, because Elizabeth didn't want to put a Catholic ruler back on the Scottish throne. And so what happened was Mary Stuart was basically imprisoned throughout England, I think in various castles, and the two never met. Like Mary Stuart and Elizabeth never met each other. And I think Elizabeth was very jealous of Mary Stuart, not just because she was the closest heir to the throne in England, but I think she was prettier also as well. Later, what happened to Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots? She was implicated in this plot. They think that was called the Babington plot, where this guy named, I think Edward Babington, was this Catholic that was trying to conspire to have Elizabeth assassinated and then put Mary on the throne. And she was implicated in it from, I think, writing letters to him. And so what happened was she was put on trial, and then in February of 1587, she was executed. And that's what you're seeing in that image right there. That's an image of Mary, Queen of Scots, being executed. And by the way, it was a horrible execution. Apparently the executioner, when he went to go cut her head off, missed and only cut off half of it. So it was kind of horrible with that. But she was pretty vicious, like I said, Elizabeth. She had a lot of people executed that were against her reign, just like Henry VIII was. Elizabeth was the one that started a lot of the, she had this huge secret service spy network that she had that was run by William Cecil, who was one of her chief advisors. And so she had a lot of eyes and ears everywhere, people that were kind of against the government and all that. Now I'm going to move on. We're going to also get to it later. She, like I said, has this son, Mary Queen of Scots, of course, which is King James. I'll get to him later, but King James is going to take over the throne and all that. But that won't be until, of course, Elizabeth dies in 1603. Now, the other thing that happened like later into her reign was Elizabeth had conflicts with Spain, which I think they often call it the Anglo-Spanish War, or Anglo-Spanish conflicts kind of broke out in the late 16th century because both England and Spain were kind of fighting for supremacy of the Atlantic Ocean at the time. Also, I think the British had a lot of, in Flanders and like Belgium in that area, they were trying to trading with like the Dutch Republic, which had become independent, which becomes independent later and all that. They want to try to trade with them and all that. But the Sea Dogs were like these pirates that will kind of emerge later that Elizabeth kind of sends out to attack Spanish shipping. And kind of show here the English Sea Dogs right there. Those were some of the famous sea dogs that were very, very famous, such as Sir John Hawkins, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And the Sea Dogs were like English privateers that were given letters of marque to attack like Spain and other states that were against the English. And it is the beginning of like the early piracy area, with the peak of the buccaneers or pirates is like around the 17th century, especially in the Caribbean and all that. And the one that's the most famous of the Sea Dogs, of course, is Sir Francis Drake. Drake, was known for not just its exploits, like say during the defeat of the Spanish Armada. He is very, very famous for being the first to circumnavigate the world by himself, without dying, which, if you know it, Ferdinand Magellan previously in the early 1500s had tried to circumnavigate the world, but he died. And remember, Juan Sebastian Elcano finished the expedition. And so with, I think, 3 ships originally, he would sail around the world in a planned expedition, which took place between 1577 to 1580. So they were planning to go around the world. As Magellan, it was just an accident that they went around the world and all that. That is the famous flagship that Drake would come back in, which is a type of English galleon ship, which is the HMS Golden Hind. That is a replica. You're looking at, I think for a long time, they actually kept the actual ship, but it rotted and they had to destroy it. And so that's a replica that you're looking at. But you can see here in this image, that's the actual route that Drake took around South America. They say he was one of the first to actually sailed around the Cape Horn, which I think that actual map is wrong. He actually sailed around the bottom of South America, which they call the Cape Horn. And you can see he's actually sailed all the way up to like close to maybe where I want to say Oregon is on the west coast of now the United States. And then he crossed the Pacific Ocean going through there. And then you can see he then sailed through the Indian Ocean around Africa to get back to, of course, Europe. And if you know about Drake, the Spanish often called him El Drake, which I think was a kind of a play on the word the dragon, which apparently when he would seize Spanish ships, not just their gold or silver like he looted, but he would burn their ships afterwards. And so that's why they call him the dragon, the Spanish. Sea Dogs, by the way, such as Drake and Sir John Hawkins, were also heavily involved, of course, in the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which happened in July, August of 1588. They say that was the peak of the whole Elizabethan era when she was on the throne and all that. And that's the thing I want to talk about next is the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which happened that year. In that year, what happened, the Spanish wanted to try and take England. Philip, remember, had been the husband of Queen Mary I, and he's kind of still thought maybe he could take over England, absorb it into his empire. And also the big thing, of course, that Philip II wanted to do, he wanted to reconvert England to being Catholic. So Philip was a big proponent of the Counter-Reformation. And so he formed this huge armada that he called it the Invincible Armada, which had something like 130 ships that were involved in it. And it was commanded by this general named Alonso Perez, which, by the way, includes something like 30,000 troops, which they were going to ferry over, and then they were going to try to take England in the throne. So they were going to try to basically convert it. And so here's kind of a map of the Armada as it came up from Spain into the English Channel. The English Navy, by the way, which had been founded by King Henry VIII, was a smaller naval force, but they were pretty pesky. Anyway, the smaller Navy, part of why they had an advantage had a lot to do with two things. One, the English used fire ships. They actually set ships on fire and sailed them through the Spanish Armada, which helped kind of break them up. And then the weather played kind of a major role. If you know about the English Channel, it is known for bad weather. And apparently the wind was blowing in the right direction, the weather vane. And so that played a role. And so the Spanish couldn't get their guns to fire on the English Navy, and they easily just lobbed their cannonballs, at the Spanish. And so what ended up happening, there was a battle called the Battle of Gravelines, which took place on August 8th, 1588. That was, they think, the most pivotal battle, which pushed the Spanish fleet into the North Sea. So basically, if you go to this map here on the left, the Spanish fleet, to try to get back to Spain, had to actually sail around Scotland and Ireland, way above there. They lost like half their fleet on the way back. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada is considered a major turning point in European history, world history overall. Because England afterwards, starts to become a major power. They're a power to reckon with. The Navy, the British Navy, later is going to be a major force in the world. It's going to be, probably one of the greatest navies anyway, up to maybe the time of World War I, World War II. And the British will even start colonizing different parts of the world, and that's going to lead into how the British Empire really starts, especially under the Stewart Dynasty a little later. One thing about Queen Elizabeth's reign, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was really the peak of her reign. There's a famous speech that she made on August 19th, 1588. It's called the Speech to the Troops at Tilbury. And it was a speech kind of to boost morale of the forces. But I guess they were anticipating that maybe they might get invaded and all that. But it's considered one of the first great speeches by a female ruler of the British. Here's kind of a quote from it right here. But I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England. So a lot of people thought she was that powerful that she was almost like a king. So anyway, that basically, like I said, was the peak of her reign. Really was that. After she died, though, she, of course, the rest of her reign was kind of a bad time. England kind of went through a period where they had plagues break out and things like that. And then there was, of course, talk about, what was going to happen to her throne, but everybody knew what was going to happen with the throne, that it was going to go to James, King James, the King of Scotland, who was James VI, and he was going to come over and become James I. And then so she would eventually die in 1603. What was her cause of death? They're still not sure. They never did a post-mortem on her or autopsy. I think there's been some speculation that she may have died from lead poisoning because of all the makeup that she would wear, which had a lot of lead in it. There's other claims that she may have died of a stroke also as well. So that's kind of still speculated on how she died, but she was pretty darn old when of course, she died, by the way. She was 69 when she died. Now, let me also talk for a few minutes also as well about William Shakespeare. That's one thing about, about the period of Queen Elizabeth. You do have the so-called Shakespearean era that occurs, which happens kind of like between the time of the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign and also the beginning of King James's reign. And, Shakespeare was the greatest, playwright probably in the world. He's, had, I think, billions of books that have been published, of course, of his plays. There's been a lot of movies made, about his plays. Of course, born originally in Stratford-upon-Avon, he was known as the Bard of Avon. He wasn't just a playwright; he was also a poet, as well. And Shakespeare is known for a lot of different plays. I kind of blow him up right here, but Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, of course, Midsummer's Night's Dream, Henry IV, Henry V, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, Hamlet, and so on. So he's had numerous plays that he's had. And you can see also he wrote 38 plays total. He also wrote sonnets. 154 sonnets were also written as well. And Shakespeare also in London had his own theater also as well, which was originally called, I think, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, but it became known as the so-called Globe Theater, which I think he joined in close to 1599 is when it started. And that's where a lot of the great plays were put on, like Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear. And if you know about a lot of the Shakespearean plays in those days, the parts played by women were usually played by men, kind of like Monty Python or something like that also. Today they have like the New Globe, I think they call it, that they've kind of built, which is kind of like a replica of the Globe Theater. But the original Globe Theater, I think, was closed, and I think one of them burned down, and the other one's closed later. I think the Puritans later, of course, closed it down. But those are the dates of when the Globe Theater existed, between pretty much the early 17th century. Now, I'm going to also move on. I want to talk for a few minutes today about the Stuarts. The Stewart Dynasty is going to come in from Scotland and take over England. This is going to lead into what we call the United Kingdom of Great Britain, because one of the things that's going to occur, if you know about it, is King James is going to come in. James will eventually come in and take over. He becomes the first ruler, really, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, with the Stuarts taking power between 1603 up to 1714. You can see in that image, that is the House of Stewart, which we'll talk about. The House of Stewart has 7 monarchs that are part of it: James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, William and Mary, William III and Mary II, and then Queen Anne. You can see on the bottom right as well. Here's also another family tree of the House of Stewart. You can see the Stuarts did go back to Scotland back in 14th century. So they go back a long way overall. And I think what happened was there was a sister of King Henry VIII that had married into the Stuarts, who was Margaret Stuart, and that's how the Stuarts were able to get the throne later. But there's King James. Like I said, James would come in. He was originally the King of Scotland, which he became the king back in 1567. And then he reigned up to 1625 as the King of Scotland. And then you can see he was King of England, also Ireland, from 1603 to 25. So he was in power like something like 57 years as a monarch at one point. It's one of the longest reigning monarchs, by the way, in European history. Believe it or not, King James. And he had two children through his wife. His main consort was Anne of Denmark, who I think the two didn't get along relationship-wise, but his main heir or issue would be King Charles I, who we'll talk about today, who later helped cause the English Civil War. And he had a daughter, Elizabeth Stewart, who became the Queen of Bohemia, later married a German and Holy Roman Empire also as well. Those are all some of the major events, of course, that happened. We'll talk about in his reign. Gunpowder Plot, you may have heard of that, which is very famous. He is very famous for colonizing different parts of the world. He's really the first British monarch to do that also as well. And you may have heard of this thing called the Gunpowder Plot that occurred really in, I guess, the third year of his reign. And the Gunpowder Plot was a Catholic conspiracy, they think, that was backed up by Jesuits to overthrow his reign and put in his daughter as the ruler. I think his daughter was, they think, Protestant, but they thought she might be more sympathetic towards Catholics. And so the conspiracy, the idea, what they were going to try to do, if you know about the Gunpowder Plot, when James was going to come to Parliament, I think the House of Lords, to make a speech, they were going to basically assassinate him by blowing him up using gunpowder barrels. And so apparently Robert Cecil, who was one of their great spy masters and advisor to King James, discovered the plot. And on November 5th, they began a bunch of arrests that were made, including Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes, who was considered, I guess, one of the most famous of the conspirators, he was actually caught guarding the gunpowder barrels. And so they were able to avoid the king being assassinated. Robert Catesby, who was also another English Catholic, they never caught him. He died in a gun battle with basically the English soldiers. But the Gunpowder Plot is kind of famous. It's called different names: Guy Fawkes Day, Bonfire Night, and it became this annual celebration in England or the UK, celebrating the fact that the king, wasn't killed, wasn't assassinated. So it's something that they've kind of made famous, and I think they've even made movies about it and all that. Now, the other thing that he's also known for, too, if you know about it, is the fact that he's like I said, one of the first British monarchs that really starts to successfully colonize. Elizabeth had tried before to try to colonize, like, I think, Newfoundland, east coast of where Virginia is, which failed. But he is successful in colonizing, like, Jamestown in Virginia, Northern Ireland, of course, and then also Bermuda. All those are areas that he will start colonizing and, of course, expand what later is, part of the British Empire and the United Kingdom today. And here's kind of show you this right here, but they have what they call the Plantation of Ulster. This was a deal where the English came into Northern Ireland and they began to colonize that area, which part of it was mostly done to create like agricultural plantations there, which is why it was called that. And what happened was settlers from mostly Scotland basically immigrated there, and they were called later Scotch-Irish, if you know about this. Some also came from England as well to settle there. It was controversial because, if you know about it, the English came in there. They started trying to convert the Irish to being, Protestant because they were Catholic. They also tried to force the English language on them as well. And so that created a lot of controversy between, the English and the Irish, and it still is today. Some of the Irish still think, that the English ought to leave and give that to the Republic of Ireland and stuff like that. So it's kind of a controversial topic, overall. Then, of course, there's kind of a map showing you can see all the Scotch-Irish that immigrate over because of that to that area around Ulster. And so that's where that term came from. And I think the term Scotch-Irish is more of a term they use, I think, in the United States, I know. Then King James, is very famous, I told you, for starting the first American colony in Virginia. That'll be, the first of the beginning of the so-called 13 British colonies that'll be there, which the Jamestown colony, founded in 1607, was an idea to try and compete with the Spanish, because the Spanish were trying to, develop, at the time, the Spanish were trying to colonize, Latin America. They were finding gold and things like that. And so they thought they could do the same thing also as well. And so they came there. And of course, the Jamestown colony, which you see in that image, was a struggle from the beginning. They didn't really know how to grow crops, and they had to get the Native Americans to help them out in all that. And so from there, they were able to create a viable colony there. But later, it leads to tensions, if you know about that, between the British and the Indians. But Jamestown will be like a foothold, in the New World for what will later be the British 13 colonies, and later, what will be the United States. The United States will kind of form out of that later after the American Revolution, etc. One more thing about James I forgot about too. Don't forget, he also was known for the King James Bible, which he issued in 1611. That is something that he's well known for because, the English had been deciding that they were going to have all their sermons, prayer books, things like that in English. And so the Anglican Church had a bunch of clergy develop this particular Bible, which was a Old English translation, of course, from the Greek Latin texts of the Old and New Testaments. So that's something he is kind of known for, of course, developing the King James Bible. But it wasn't the first English Bible, but it became the standard Bible that the Anglican Church used afterwards. Now, I want to also talk for a few minutes about King Charles I. He had a son that took over. Charles would come in 1625 and become the king. And second Stewart. And if you know about Charles I, he was the one that famously caused the English Civil War to break out in 1642. And the English Civil War was a major conflict in British history. It totally changed England forever. And part of the problem with the Stuarts was that they believed heavily in divine right. King James I and Charles I believed that the monarch ought to have absolute power, kind of like the Bourbon monarchs that are kind of developing in France at the time. And so on top of that, if you know about Charles, he had married this woman named Henrietta Maria, who was the actual sister of Louis XIII. And that caused a lot of controversy as well. The fact that basically she was French and Catholic. And so there was kind of a lot of worry about what was going to happen to the monarchy in England. They thought he was kind of too sympathetic, towards, Catholics and absolutism. One thing about the English Civil War, it wasn't really fought because of him. It wasn't a deal where they didn't like the king, that kind of thing. It was really more about the governance of the country, like how England was going to be governed overall. And Parliament, English Parliament, wanted a limited monarchy where the monarch didn't have a whole lot of power, and the Parliament basically decided what the strings of power would be, versus the monarch wanting total power. So that's the whole reason why the whole thing, of course, occurred. So it's called different names. I'll get to it later, but the English Civil War, it's called all kinds of names. The English Civil War is the common name. Some people call it the British Civil War. It's also sometimes called the War of the Three Kingdoms because it did at one point involve England. It involved also Ireland and also Scotland as well. So they all kind of get embroiled in a huge war at one point. And I'll kind of talk about the beginning of the war and how it kind of broke out. There was this thing that happened in 1628 where Parliament thought that King Charles I had too much power. So what happened was in 1628, they issued this thing called the Petition of Right. What this act basically did by Parliament was it prevented the monarch from raising taxes himself, also raising or actually passing edicts that he was trying to do as well. And so Parliament believed that only they could actually do that, control the strings of the money or pass any kind of laws. And so at first he agreed to actually the Petition of Right, but if you know what happened in 1629, Charles decided that he didn't really want to do that. And so he responded by basically abolishing Parliament. And so between 1629 to 1640, they had no Parliament. It was actually shut down. And so England went through a period that they sometimes call the 11 Years' Tyranny or the personal rule of Charles I, where he acted as an absolutist on the country. And so that's the closest that really England got to becoming like, say, France, like Louis XIV. The only thing that happened, though, of course, was that he needed money because, to run the state and all that, which Parliament controlled a lot of that. And so Charles was forced to eventually call Parliament again in 1640. It was all because of wars breaking out in Europe at the time. Like they had the war, the Austrian Succession that broke out in the 1640s. And then I think I also had this war that broke out, I know, with Scotland. It was called the Bishops' War. And so he summoned the Parliament in 1640, which became known as the Short Parliament because it was only in power for about 3 months. And apparently they wouldn't do what he wanted, so he shut them down. And then he called the Long Parliament afterwards by the fall, and that was the one that'll be in power for 20 years. It's called that because of basically in power from 1640 to 1660. But when he brought them in, he still struggled. And part of what happened was Parliament. There was a lot of members of Parliament that were part of the Puritans, and Puritans were these Anglicans that wanted to adopt Reformed theology, or they wanted to make the Protestant church purely Calvinist and purify it of any kind of Catholicism. And so he tried to arrest a bunch of their members, and what happened was it caused the whole English Civil War to blow up afterwards. And so that's what happens. You get the English Civil War that breaks out, and you get these opposing sides that basically are against each other, as in most civil wars that happen. And so on one side, you've got the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers are those that support Charles I. There's the so-called Royalists, which I guess is their official name. And these are predominantly people that are, associated with the nobility, wealthy landowners, even members of the Catholic Church, Anglican Church or Catholic Church were kind of involved in it as well. And then they're opposed by the parliamentarian side, which were often nicknamed the Roundheads. And these were supporters of Parliament that opposed, Charles I. Many of them came from like the middle class and Puritan class, Puritans as well. And I think there's a theory that they were called Roundheads because of the shape of their helmets, had kind of a round shape to it and all that. And over time, what would happen is part of why the parliamentarian or Roundhead side won the war was the fact that the English were able to develop this pretty good army called the New Model Army, which was a professional army of England that was fought all over. It fought pretty much throughout all the three main kingdoms. And over time, this particular army would become very powerful. It used, muskets, which most armies were starting to use in the 17th century. It also had pretty good commanders that were part of it. The one on the right, of course, was more famous Oliver Cromwell. We'll get to him later. He, of course, was the one that headed up eventually the new model army by the end of the year, into the actual Civil War. But Sir Thomas Fairfax was actually the main commander originally of it. He was known as, I think they called it Black Tom, and but those are the two commanders. But Cromwell was mostly a cavalry general that eventually took over England after they got rid of the monarchy. There, of course, later is Cromwell at the head of the new model army. He would later go on to crush basically Charles's armies. And like I said, it was one of the best well armed. They had musketry, which the types of musketry they mostly used. They started using different things like the matchlock originally, but I think by the end of the war, they had this new type of musket that came in that was kind of a precursor to later flintlock muskets, which is the so-called wheel lock or dog lock. They call it sometimes. You see there, that's so-called dog lock or wheel lock. And then they also use things like pikes. Pikes are still being used, which I know with the infantry, they use pikes to basically stop cavalry, which it was very successful with. And then cannon were also starting to be used also as well in the war. So I'll talk about it later, but this new model army, it's going to go on at the Battle of Naseby to crush basically King Charles's army. And that's going to later lead to eventually the English Civil War ending, which, like I said, will last almost a decade, but had devastating results pretty much. It would change England forever, pretty much. Over time, what's going to end up happening, which I'll talk about next week, they're eventually going to go to a more limited monarchy. So remember the 4th of November. I like that. But anyway, I'm going to, of course, talk about next week. Next week, I'm going to kind of go into more into the rise of the British Empire. I'll talk about the Stewart Dynasty more. We'll talk about that because really under the Stuarts is when the British Empire starts expanding more. And it really peaks under the House of Hanover. Like Queen Victoria's reign, they think is often considered to be the peak of the British Empire. Now I'll kind of go into some of the later monarchs they have also as well. Like I'll talk about the House of Windsor, which are the current rulers that are reigning now over the British. So I'll get into that later. So I will have like a kind of a canvas quiz course coming up on that topic, but not until like week 8. So before I go, I did want to remind y'all, don't forget first exam. That's the main thing y'all need to be concentrating on right now. Try to wrap that up by next week. And then first exam bonus quiz, of course, still out. And then don't forget the second vocabulary, of course. I think that's due at the end of next week, next Friday, to get that wrapped up as well. And that's pretty much it. I don't think I see any at least I don't see any questions. I know. Yeah, V for Vendetta. Yeah, with the whole, that whole gunpowder plot, all that. So I'll see y'all. Of course, y'all have a good weekend. I know it's kind of a short week this week because we had a recorded lecture, of course, on Monday I gave you. But I'll see you, of course, next week and all that for this part 2 lecture. So y'all take care and all that. So have a great weekend later.